Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today I am here with typology expert Dario Nardi, and we are going to be discussing a lot about using typology for integration, self-growth, the shadow, and a lot of his work. So how's it going?
Absolutely. It's going well. Thank you, Megan, for having me today.
Yeah. So what I guess I feel is so interesting about a lot of your work, and why I think a lot of the online type community is so excited about your work, is that I think you have such an innovative mindset when it comes to type, and always wanting to add on to the things that we have learned and that Jung talked about a decade ago, or not a decade, a century ago, like kind of adding on to this knowledge base. And I really appreciate that from you. But for those who are not familiar with your work, would you like to just sort of introduce yourself and give a little mini description or bio of what it is that you do in the typology world?
Sure. Yeah. It all began around 1993, I believe, and some friends, I was in graduate school then, they were talking type, and I was curious, what's this about? And to make a long story short, I ended up getting certified in psychological testing, and that was mainly with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, step one. Although I'm not like a big instrument person, really my interest was to continue to understand. I was very lucky to be under the mentorship of Dr. Linda Behrens, who is, like marriage and family therapist, but also a really huge proponent and teacher of type since the early 70s. So really going back, she was a student of David Kiersey, and then I was able to be her student in a sense, and I really learned a tremendous amount. And so much of what I was learning in graduate school in engineering jived with the systems principles and so on that she had learned in systems psychology, which is like what you would get in marriage and family therapy. The family is a system. The psyche is a system. So it took a while for me to actually get interested in Jung and to appreciate it, because there's so much to explore, as people know, on the internet, just with, 16 types, but then there's variation within that. There's the mental functions, Jungian functions, temperament, like the David Kiersey stuff on temperament. There's the social interaction styles. So there was a tremendous amount of applications and all of this. And, I was learning at a time when there wasn't really any online community, but there was a very rich, active, expert, professional type community. So people who were using in their work, some of them for decades, in working with large organizations, small organizations, like across the board. So there's a tremendous amount of wisdom there. A lot of those people have retired or even passed away since the 90s and early 2000s.
I was going to ask, do you feel like that group, do you think that has kind of subsided a little bit at all when you say that back then?
Yeah, even if they're still active professionally, they don't really do a lot online. I think that they're either from like the oldest part of the boomer generation or the silent generation before that. And so that's why I don't see as much. And so in talking about, what is my work, I preface it by saying that really there's all of this work that's gone before.
Yeah.
And a tremendous, like there's, God, how many publications, I don't know, on all these different topics and questions, and all of this wisdom that's come in from people who are practicing therapists and university faculty and all of this. So I came into this and I saw that there were two things, or I've come to see there are two things that we need for the 21st century, that I really want to help it be that bridge for younger people especially to know. But, in order for type to survive, neuroscience, scientific basis, whatever that's going to be. I don't know. I've been doing research since 2006 with that, and we can talk about that. And then the other is that what makes type so special is it's not about categorizing. It looks like that and it can be used like that, but really its secret sauce or like its superpower is it's about development. And
Awesome.
that, and that's, those to me are the two really special things that going forward are going to keep it very, very relevant and fresh. And so I don't feel like I'm the kind of person that's like, oh, we need to expand it in order for the sake of expanding. Like, I definitely feel that there's a mission underneath and like a guiding
Wow.
principle of like scientific basis in neuroscience, which I'm able to bring. And then this developmental piece, and in all of our lives, your life, my life, are all laboratories
Hmm.
for development.
Yeah. And something I personally think about a lot is just with how much media has changed, how do you conserve a lot of that wisdom that has been passed down to you? So, what is, I guess, your interest with that, or in general, like, do you think how can we like connect those dots?
Hmm. Yeah, so I'm seeing. I believe that there are a number of people asking this question.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Not a lot, though. Because the
Yeah.
internet, for the most part, is this place where you have a few people coming forward being gurus, and and they're quite young, and they haven't gone through the whole midlife process and all of that, nor are they really interested in asking the question you just asked. So,
Yeah, and what I've found is that the internet, like the cycle of conversation keeps getting shorter and shorter. And I've been kind of around the internet community since 2012. So for me, that feels like a long time. For you, that seems like, oh, not probably not that long. But from what I've seen, even just in that, I feel like the same um there's like the people that have been around in the community for a while that are debunking the same things over and over and over, because as new people come in, they get these same misconceptions. And then it's just, at least for me, from my perspective, and why I'm excited to have you on, is that I'm kind of sick of having the same conversation.
yeah, yeah.
I don't want to have to explain again and again, like, oh, no, FE doesn't mean that you don't have your own feelings, or like, oh, no, thinkers doesn't mean that you don't care about other people. Like, and so I
Yeah.
guess I think that there is this sort of interesting fragmentation in the mediums, where like all these things that are happening in books and in conferences, or that um yeah and how do we
So,
bring that? Yeah.
I see a couple. I can make a few suggestions, and I've seen a few things. One
Mhm.
is I want people to be aware on the internet. There's a huge resource that has been kept for half a century.
Mhm.
This is www.capt.org,
Mm.
a Center for Application of Psychological Type. They have an enormous database called Milo with thousands and thousands, like it was 6,000 entries in the 90s. So I don't know how many they have today of all of the dissertations, master's theses, popular articles, books, recorded talks, like everything across the board. They have all in one place. So when people come and they wonder, like, oh, is there research on like type and Asperger's? And like, I wonder, and then they start a discussion, which is great. But I want them to know actually there's like a half dozen like published papers on this topic that actually sampled like hundreds of people who have Asperger's and gave them the assessment and did all of these things. So I want folks to know that on the internet, it's a searchable database. You don't need to pay for it or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And so I'd say that's one good thing. Another good thing is that there are slowly growing some online, I want to say like communities, like Personality Hacker, for example,
Mhm.
that are aware of the richness of type and its background, and are also doing really great stuff to reach out to people and get them to interact and to learn and grow. And it's not just about analyzing or something like that. Like it's really like a lively community.
Mhm.
Um, I think that the YouTube actually can be beneficial when we have people who are not of the usual types and who are
Mhm.
interested in type. So like ESTP, ESFJ, and so on, come forward and do like several videos and talk from their point of view.
Yeah.
And yeah,
That's actually how I got started, is that in like 2015, I didn't see that many ENFJs whenever I would search it. And I saw so many INFJs. And so I wanted to just kind of be like, hey guys, I'm an ENFJ. And I like posted it on like Personality Cafe and stuff. And I guess so. a couple, a couple questions for you actually is one, how did you go from being interested in MBTI to being interested in Jung? Like how did he start coming up more in the conversation, as you said that it kind of slowly went in there? And kind of going off of that, what I'm curious about is, what is it about the subject that you love so much, or like why are you still here? Like why do you believe that this, you know, is something really important to you?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great question. So initially there was this curiosity in what is this about? And I was introduced through David Kiersey's and Marilyn Bates, Please Understand Me, volume 1, and at first edition. And I really could almost immediately type all of the people on my family. And that really gave me, so I'm just saying like my personal answer gave me this point. It's like, oh, like I'm INTJ preferences, which explain, and I'm like 2% of the population or something like that. So it's like, no wonder I feel weird. And as I get into it more, I could see things like, oh, like I can fit in really well in a lot of conventional situations using extroverted thinking. That's one side of me. That's an extroverted side. So it is not like I'm an introvert. That's just like a, you know, like a preference, like hand preference. So, but then I have this other side, introverted intuiting, that's like this really weird, like it doesn't fit in any society ever. And that's almost its nature. You know, it's truly countercultural, not like fun, hippie countercultural. It's got this like always at the margins. So, okay, like I can appreciate that. So I saw like, where are my strengths? Where are my blind spots? For other people I knew, things began to make more sense. Of course, I asked questions like which types get along with which other types. There's no, I don't think, magic formula for that.
Yeah, and that's what I guess I'm curious about, is what I've noticed is that people naturally start with questions like that, and then they're kind of hit a wall. And then it's like either you could discard type and say, okay, I know the type, I know what type I am and what my friends are and all that. But if there's no magic type of like who you're supposed to end up with, or like whatever, like who your friend should be, then what do you, then how do you, I guess, move past that and use the tool?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So this is I didn't have this answer at the starting out, but you know, other people in the type community thought about this answer. I would say Peter Geyer, who's a like historian of the type community, he's Australian. You know, he said that Jung did not intend, he didn't use the word model. He did not intend it to be a model. He intended it to be a therapeutic tool, and not even tool, a therapeutic framework. And the idea is that the 8, we'll call them functions, he called them types, were like a mandala. And they're everything is like, you know, a mandala is something that you keep going back to. It has a visual and relational quality to it that each time you look at it over weeks, months, years, you may see something new that you didn't see before. And that's how I view type, is that when we get into the Jungian part of it, all of a sudden we're saying like, I'm going to remain engaged with this as a self-therapeutic framework. And then it becomes a symbol in the same way that Christ on the cross is a symbol, that the American flag is a symbol. But I think it's more complex than that, because not really one, it's 8 symbols, or 4, or 16, or 256, or whatever you want to go into it. And so that was, I felt, is like the number one thing that's kept me engaged. The other 2 things were, some of it is I was caught up in what we would say like the academic politics of the 90s, because type had gotten to a point in the culture where it was just about the MBTI 4-letter code. Yeah. And I'm an INTJ, and as if that were like a, you know, a giraffe or an address. And there was this like a backlash against that within the professional type community to say, like, excuse us, like, what happened to the mental functions? Not just like F and T, but like type dynamics, type development. Like it's ended up being really accepted in corporate America and education and these different places. And it's like, it lost its weight and its value. So I was part of that movement to help reclaim that. I wasn't the leader of it. I'm just somebody going along, contributing.
So reclaiming, I guess, the use of it as a framework for development.
Yeah, to show
So
that there's like another level. Yeah.
yeah, quick question on that is, what are your thoughts on using it for personnel selection?
Um, well, in terms of hiring, in some states it's actually illegal to do that.
Okay.
So people should keep that in mind. I believe California is one of those states. It is meant to be like a self-reflection and coaching tool. And yes, of course, many studies, published studies, have been done looking at particular areas like nursing or construction or elementary school teachers or whatever it is, and you see strong type biases. The
Yeah.
nurses tend to be SFJs. And
Yeah.
this is not a surprise, no matter what framework. If you're using strong interest inventory or a five-factor model, you're going to see these biases. But
Yeah.
you also see that within every one of those domains, there are people of all types
Yeah.
who are successful in contributing and doing something to it. So when somebody says, oh, it's not a good predictor of performance, I'm like, it's not even
Yeah.
remotely designed to be that way or used that way. It's to help the person figure out what are their strengths, what do they like to do, what gives them energy, how can they make their whatever it is that they do joyful and
Yeah.
make it their own. And that was one of the original impetuses of the Myers-Briggs version, was to help people find not the right career, although it could do that with their own self-reflection, but also how to make their career enjoyable.
Yeah, something I've thought about recently too is that, take the nurses example, like let's say it's popular amongst SFJs. One could assume that that means that it takes like strong FE and SI in order to do the job right. But what if all of our nurses are SFJs, then doesn't that mean we have a huge lack of like NI and TE in that profession? So I guess, well, one, I completely agree with you. And I'm even skeptical of using the big five for personnel selection. Like, I mean, you could argue that it's a trait or something that it's easier to test or predict, but I'm not sure ethically. But anyway.
Even for performance, and just to give a
Yeah.
short example, so years ago, I used to have students do these like term projects all the time, and they didn't have to choose a temperament or type, but they often did. And one of them worked in a banking office, and he made the effort of doing a temperament assessment, just temperament, on all of the people who were the salespeople in the bank, and then doing like a little interview with them, and then he wrote up about this. And he used another model too to complement it. But the long story short was that they all brought different strengths. So that there was one, among the bankers, there were the SJ bankers who were the ones comfortable with paperwork and would often be the ones to volunteer for more, we'll say, like boring or arduous detail work. There were the SPs who were, coincidence or not, the top sellers in terms of being able to get loans out and like all of the stuff that they were able to do. NTs, of course, he noticed that the one thing, I think there were maybe two NTs in the group, is that they were good at scouting and bringing in new what are called products. But in banking, that means like it's basically a new strategy for how to make money to meet a particular need. The one NF in the group, she was not a top seller. She didn't like a lot of paperwork. She didn't introduce new products. What she did do, though, is when somebody was unhappy with their experience, in other words, a customer, especially if that was a high, because they did boutique banking. So if it was particularly a high-paying customer, guess who they always sent that person to?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And it's like, she may not be the highest performer, but she really needs to be here.
Yeah. You have to make sure that you're valuing your customer, or else ways of making money will just fall flat. Like, depending on, how much you're nurturing those relationships. Something I talk about a lot on my channel that I really believe is that in order to really create something new, whether that's a business or art or whatever it is that you're creating, that you kind of should or need to, I don't know how to necessarily phrase that, consider all eight areas of
Mhm.
the psyche, or else you're going to bump into somebody else smacking you over the head for not considering that area. And so that's one of the main reasons why I really want to talk about this sort of self-development process, is because I think that people can make the mistake, and I want to know your thoughts, the way you interpret this as well, but I think that people can make the mistake of like, oh, okay, well, if I'm an NF, then these are these careers over here that I could do. Or
Mhm.
like, for example, like I have experience in marketing. Let's say I'm like, okay, I'm really great at, making people care. Well, I also have to like do data analysis of that and figure out what works. Or like, let's say if are coming up with new products, like for the
Mhm.
NT side, you also have to make sure that people care about that product. So it's like really anything you do is going to uh, have to do with all of it.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
kind of like, how do you, I guess, see that?
Well, for all the people who are, we would call like type enthusiasts,
Yeah.
that it's a hobby, that know that the number one application in business in a practical way is team coaching. This
Mm-hmm.
is, yes, individual coaching is a big piece, but the point of the team coaching is to know that our team, maybe of say 7 people, has strengths that are shared. It has blind spots. Many times, teams face multiple different things. When Linda and I worked together on co-authoring books, we made an explicit point of, Linda and I are both NT types.
Mm-hmm.
We passed anything that was like comparative type descriptions like NF, NT, SJ, SP to the NF in our group to make sure that there weren't glaring biases in terms of how the language that's used, does it feel welcoming, all of that. We would, of course, the SP in the group was the one always thinking about, like, is this too complicated? What's a visual way to present this? How is this going to fit in the marketplace? Like, he's already thinking mostly about marketing and sales, even as we're brainstorming how the product, what it's going to
Yeah.
contain and how we're going to design it. And then we would always go out and get feedback from literally dozens of people of all different types.
Yeah.
And so that's just a
Mhm.
little microcosm of the value
Yeah.
of considering all functions, even if you can't do it within yourself.
Yes, I love that so much. And I recently read the one that you did with Linda. I know you might have done multiple, but just like the basic type descriptions ones where it's
The
like in
grounding,
their own words. Yeah.
yeah.
That really came through for me. And because my best friend who's an ENFP in my podcast Synchronic Saturdays, we talk a lot about how do we make this come across to NE and NI? Like how do we do that? And that was
Mm.
like one of the main things that I really realized from that book. I'm like, oh man, this is like an NI-NE brainchild right here, because you like debunked things, but then you're like, here's the point.
Mhm.
Like, because that's just, I guess, one example personally that I've realized with NE is that sometimes, like, if I go in and I say, here's my NI point, but I haven't like debunked all the other possibilities, then there might not be a clear receiver of what I'm saying, if that makes sense. But
Yeah, yeah, and that's
yeah,
that's a very common challenge with NI, so I can relate completely. Yeah,
yeah. So another thing, so talking about this mandala or if I said that,
mandala.
mandala, yes, gotcha.
Bilang
Um,
mandala.
what another thing about a lot of your work that I appreciate is the calling it a type pattern, and thinking of it as a mandala really makes sense to me, because it's not just the tip top of what your personality appears like, and it's like this constantly unraveling thing. So I don't know if you've had this experience or what advice you can give to people using type in this way, but for me, it feels like every time I understand myself, it's like there's always more layers coming. It's like every time I feel like I've understood something, even about type or about how my personality works, it just feels like a spiral, almost like a labyrinth too,
Mhm,
where
mhm.
it's like I thought that I just was here, but then now I'm here. And I think that, talking about individuation and, you know, integrating your shadow, kind of thinking of it as a pattern makes a lot of sense to me, that it's not just like a static thing. It's something that is constantly unraveling. Or how do you see that?
Well, you know, I believe that inherently it's the psyche is like this, you know, psychedelic jungle in a way. And there are vast areas which are undeveloped in a person. There are things which are purely part of the human, like primal need experience. There's cultural stuff and from our childhood, which we've forgotten, things that are part of really our personal shadow in our lives. And so there's this whole landscape. And Jung talked about like how sort of I don't want to say like the life purpose, but if you wanted to be doing therapy in some way, that really you want to make the unconscious conscious. You want to shed some light on it, bring the darkness into the light. That's actually a dangerous task. And he described it, especially in his stuff and talking about yoga and working with the shadow and archetypes. He said, you know, it's very easy when we begin doing development kind of work in whatever format. You know, it doesn't have to be type. It's whatever format it is, the person truly is getting the person to develop, that they can, you know, become a victim of the archetypes within themselves. They can be in the grip of a shadow function, which maybe if they had remained like small and rigid wouldn't have happened. You know, the tree that never bears fruit will never suffer birds eating its fruit. And that's, you know, so he really, you know, said in a way like it's a danger to develop. But on the other hand, if we have some kind of compass or tool, I don't know I don't think those are either of his words that he would use, but I think we can use those. Then we might even say like a mirror in a way, some kind of guide. That allows us to at least maybe get through life with, you know, without getting killed or falling asleep again. And so it best, it like, it helps us. And he said a lot of times if stuff comes up from the unconscious, it manifests and we have a choice to either push it down and smother it, or it will come out in some very negative ways. Or we can use our own ego. I mean, the ego will make an effort to use it in some way. And to transform it. And I don't think any of that is easy. I would say if a person is genuinely doing shadow work, it's unpleasant. Like it's unpleasant, and it will remain unpleasant as long as the process keeps working itself out. And is it worth it? You know, I try and think if I were the INTJ who remains in the cubicle at the big company, doing programming and design, and which is perfectly fine. I mean, it meets like a lot of my type needs, and I have some hobbies on the side, like hiking or whatever. Like all of that could be fine. But what if I really, instead, one of those INTJs who steps outside of that culturally safe box? Because in a way, like the tech box is what society gives NTs, is their like way to keep breathing, psychologically speaking. But you know, it's scary to step outside of that. And you know, when you step off the path for anything, you know, there's all of that like, oh, right, I'm going to make my own path off the beaten trail. You can also just get lost in the woods and be eaten by animals or fall off a cliff or die of hypothermia. So there are these points where it's dangerous. And so I think type, if your person is really serious about developing, and I don't just mean like, oh, I'm going to get physically fit and have healthier diets and so on, which are all great, good habits, that we need some kind of tool. And there are many good clinical tools, but I think that Jung's framework is one of those that non-clinicians can relate to and still have a benefit. Whereas I think like some clinical tools like transactional analysis are also amazing, but it's a very sort of cynical framework. Like you have to be a therapist to know not to take it personally. And with type, it sort of magically wanders through this land of like, it's personal, but it doesn't feel like it's mean to me. And it's, you know, it has this like certain welcoming, I mean, obviously, because so many people after 100 years are still engaged with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you believe that the shadow can initiate you rather than choosing whether or not, like, because I can imagine some people listening might be, I don't know if I want to do the shadow work. That sounds hard. But do you think that we always have a choice?
I suspect Jung would say we always do have a choice.
Mm.
At some level, we make a choice.
Mm.
And it's understandable. Maybe, a lot of people who reach midlife, they're going to be in a position where they want to change careers. They want to do something different. They may not be happy with their marriage partner anymore. But they have children. They have to make a living. Society imposes requirements on them to basically say, like, you only have a little bit of room to develop, and the person has no choice. It's like, it's if you're going to put fish in a fish tank, or you're going to have like only so much space for a plant to grow, it can only grow so much. And that's the way it is.
Well, that even makes me think too about how perhaps a lot of our systems and expectations in society don't necessarily facilitate this process. Because if a lot of uncomfortable emotions come up and you have mouths to feed and you have to go to a job that you don't want to go to, you can't be like, I don't know, like that becomes difficult. So in a way, maybe you can say it's a privilege. But I guess what I want to know too is, since clearly you are interested in development, what makes it worth it to you? Choosing whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
No, I mean, that's a really good question. I have to say today in particular, I don't feel very positive about it. So I'm not going to give like the joyous answer. I would say that development always exacts a price. And that's, so is it consider, like, both you and I are NJ types.
Mm-hmm.
And so SP types hold a certain fascination, as well as a certain, like, whatever. But there's to really engage that other side of ourselves, to engage in a relationship with an SP type, or to do things that are actually, I don't mean like, oh, we're gonna go outside and go for a hike or some like simple extroverted sensing thing. I mean, like, extroverted sensing involves risk and danger and uncertainty. By its nature, it is the most, like, it's the one that can have the biggest rewards and have the biggest dangers involved with it. Like, you can get killed from, I know somebody who developed his extroverted sensing, and so he took up dirt, like, bike racing. And then he ended up in an accident and was in a cast and all of these things for like 9 months. And it was a huge process of getting over, and not his version of extroverted sensing.
Yeah.
So I would say there is that. On the other hand, I feel like I know just enough now that I would sort of, if I stop in place, then I die. And I'm okay stopping in place. Yeah, and I'm okay stopping in place when I get to the introverted sensing, like, arena, because that's what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
But let's push that off for a while, or better yet, have somebody in my life that can help me keep that up just enough, so that, because it's not just introverted sensing is routine or something cognitive. It's comfortable, it's safe, it's conscious, but in a very different way than NJ types would think about it. But it does lend itself to a certain, like, safety. It's not just concerned about safety, it provides safety. And so my thought is, it's like, it's not that we're going to develop all of the functions. Anybody who comes to me and says, oh, I've developed all of the functions, or I'm developing them, and I'm like, no, and that's okay. Like, but we can do things in our lives to at least, like, have people around us, so that type development as a group is a team effort, is a we effort.
Yes. And I think that, I don't know if this is partially my FE talking, but from my perspective, the most important thing is at least recognizing that the other people have other functions. And like, because I think it's just very hurtful to other people and to yourself if you assume that everybody works the way you do. Like, it's not about like feeling like you have to act like an ESFP all the time, but just being aware, oh, okay, SE is a thing that exists. Like, I think it respects someone else's reality as well. And it also makes room for you to step into more SE if it's something that you choose. But there doesn't need to be that much pressure. So kind of going off of that, how should people approach developing the functions then, if you so choose?
So three things come to mind. One is that word pattern that you mentioned earlier, and remembering that function or whatever sits within a larger pattern, and that there's no reason to like falsify yourself by saying, oh, I'm going to be like an ESFP or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's not me. I have to think about where does it sit in my pattern. The other is hang around people who embody it in a healthy way. Now, healthy doesn't mean they have to be highly developed. Oftentimes, children can embody a function in a healthy way. And that's fine. It's a lesson and not going to get burned from that usually. So having the people there. And then the other is, I would say, engage in some kind of hobby that gives room for it. And I don't mean like, especially there's a tendency with the TJ types to be like, assign ourselves a to-do list. And, oh, I'm going to do this between this time, and that will be developing this function. And it really is about creating a space. And to borrow a term from the last 10 years, it's creating a safe space for a part of your psyche to come up and express itself without worrying that it's going to be run bulldozer the moment it steps out of line with the ego's idea of what we're supposed to be doing. And in practice, that can often mean just setting aside a space and a time to say, I'm going to turn off my cell phone and leave it somewhere else. I'm going to hang out with different kind of people or be by myself or whatever is needed. And I'm going to allow enough time, whether that's 3 hours or a whole day or whatever it is, to truly enjoy and allow whatever it is, that hobby, to come up. And then, you mentioned when we talked before about a growth mindset, that's sort of like the piece that ties those three together. Because without the growth mindset, then people will be like, oh, well, that was a bad experience, or I didn't get anything out of it. And I would say to people like, you can Google like, what is growth mindset? I think a lot of it is just saying, like, trying to frame it to say, what did I learn? And then how could I do this again and maybe have a better experience? And so it's being engaged with it in like a, not naive way, but a positive way. And that's, and not being defensive while in experiences.
Yeah. So as you were talking, I was thinking about how you mentioned earlier that a lot of times NJs might want to, live differently, or we feel really like a part of counterculture. And so I think that a lot of NJs might be interested in the idea of being able to completely transform themselves and like develop the depths of themselves. And I think that we could maybe even assume that because our NI is seeing this pattern, that means that we've got it all figured out, or that, oh, okay, so I see the pattern. And when you were talking about the SE, it kind of just made me realize like how hard SE really could be when you do try and bring that to light. Because a lot of NJs, like the NJs that if you Google like famous NJs, you're going to see all these visionary people that did something. They did something, or else you wouldn't know about them.
Right, yeah.
So, and they probably had to take a lot of risks to get there, and take a lot of probably some care of their body so that they don't burn out to even get there, and to be able to sustain all of that. How do you think
this brings to mind something important, which I feel like I want to say to the NP folks who are listening. So their growth area, that's sort of the mirror, the counterpoint is introverted sensing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say for those folks, they might wonder, how can I develop that?
Yeah.
Well, it's not about completely transforming or something like that, because that's not even what their development experience is like. It's a lot of small incremental things in life. It's about raising the bar in terms of standards of enjoying life. It's about having a certain feeling of connection and stability so that they can actually be in the clouds and all of the times that they want to. And it's also, this developing habits. And I would say for the NP folks, and I really think that there's a piece of advice for every type and temperament and whatnot. And for the NP folks, I would say the important piece of advice is pick carefully what your habits are when you're younger. Because as you get older, introverted sensing is going to really solidify those habits and make them difficult to break out of. And you're going to be, say, even 40 or something, and you're like, oh, I never got into the routine of doing exercise. And now even psychologically, your psyche doesn't want to start a new habit. You're comfortable with how things go. And so what are the good habits? Conversely, for the NJs, I would say it's also important to start doing some habits that make sure as you get much older and you're neglecting introverted sensing for a long time, you can come back and say, oh, good, I own property, or oh, good, I have a retirement account, or something like that. Retirement accounts are great. That's, you can't start too early, but, to have a few things running in the background. So in that sense, I would say, there is advice for all of the types, and there is room for all of the functions, but that doesn't mean I have to be doing introverted sensing. Or when I say, when you have an experience, I don't mean for the INTP, oh, you need to go and do something physically, which is usually the INTP is oh, I can run a simulation in my head. I'm like, maybe you can, but at least talk to some other people about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've even been noticing with the stay-at-home orders and everything, how much I take just being out in nature for granted, and how I'm man, I cannot sit on a couch every day the rest of my life. I need to be for real. I need to make sure I'm taking care of myself, because would even not walking to my car or something, it's so weird how I guess the ego can even attach to things, because it's I was so bad at sports growing up that I think I sort of identified as I'm not a sports person. I think about things and it's oh, I don't need to worry about that. I'm doing these other creative things over here. So it's almost in my mind, I had a negative association with oh, well, why do you even want to work out? Why do you care what you look like to other people or something? So it's we could sort of, I don't know. It's not that every intuitive now needs to all of a sudden love sensing. But I think it's just interesting to think about the way that we tell stories to ourselves about certain things, and we bias ourselves in that way. So another question I wanted to ask you too is the whole idea about how static do you believe these cognitive functions are? Do you think that, the definitions that Carl Jung first proposed 100 years ago, do you think that as humans evolve, that the actual function can evolve?
So Jung himself talked about this, and from what I remember, he identified these 4 functions. He also identified, and he called them mental functions to distinguish them from other kinds of functions, which he would call the religious function, the transcendent function. There's a healing, a storyteller function, and so on, which seem to be part of our human basic operating system. And then within that, there are some mental functions which were biased in particular ways. And he said there could certainly be, we could grow into a direction where there is a species where there are more functions, or they're somewhat different. And they are the results. I mean, he was very much an anthropologist in a way, traveling around the world and folklore and religion and mythology and looking at how people live differently, how they represent their experiences symbolically. And he chose the word function for a reason, because for those folks who might remember like the end of high school or the beginning of college, if you remember what's called a function in math, like y equals x times 2 plus b, or whatever it is, those are just a set of relationships. There's no numbers you plug into them. That's a separate task. So I can plug in like 10 for the b or -5 or whatever it is. And he said the whole idea of the functions is that they're very abstract, and that depending upon the person's culture, their upbringing, sex, career, all of these things. I mean, he talked about other stuff too, like the demands of society to get through school, to get married, to go through the military, like all of this stuff. We have natural inborn talents as musician or athlete. You know, they're athletes of every type because they have a genetic predisposition and their parents encourage them. And so he said, you know, the type is a way that we mediate all of those qualities within us, and that we're not necessarily limited to those 4. And each one is actually, anybody who says, oh, like extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling is about like group values. I'm like, extroverted feeling is about nothing. Because it's not, you know, it's there as a symbol in relationship to the other functions. And when a person says it's like this, I'm like, that's great. You've picked out like a facet of it, and focus on that facet and work with it for a while, but don't get lost in it, because that's not the only facet. And in another society, it could look different. And I think a great example of extroverted feeling is how culture, not just American culture, we're talking all about around the world, mostly will encourage women to have one version of extroverted feeling, like a standard version. And then for men, it's like, oh, well, no, cover that up a little bit or make it more aggressive, or it's more like a paternalistic feeling. Yeah. And the male father of 5 who's an ESFJ, that's a different feeling function. And so there's a different flavor to it. And the word function also means process. And so it's a process we continually engage in. And
would you agree that you could think of it as like each function is almost like, I want to say container, but I don't know if that's a bad word for it, but it's like your soul and your essence like fills it and uses the functions as it wishes?
I would say there's like a cloud of, imagine like, you know, like electric sparks and fog and all of these things that condensate, that make up a cloud, and there's wind and all of this stuff that's there. And the function comes in and starts to develop in order to create like a permeable container that holds some of that and allows it to condense and to become something. Instead of just potential, instead of just elements, it creates like a little, you know, container in a way, but not like a closed container, one that is interactive with the world and somehow provides like the opportunity for the elements to come to work together and to self-organize. And that's, and then eventually, you know, that in the case of human beings, that's really finding our expression over the course of our life.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about, so in your book, The 8 Keys to Self-Leadership, you talk a little bit about almost like, I forget the term you use, but almost like the different dimensions of how good you are with the function and how it could kind of become more complex. So there's a less complex version and a more complex. How do you suggest, when thinking about it in that way, because you have tools and tips in the book, can you explain how we should be thinking about it in terms of, do we even need all of our functions to be like super highly complex, or, you know what I mean? Like how do you see that?
Well, you know, I mean, there's 2 schools of thought, and you know, the most simple we can say, just say there's like a basic or passive version of each function and an active or advanced version of each function. So that some of that is from Jung, talking about how as human beings, we have a certain capacity to do all of the functions. And when he talks about type, he's talking about one-sidedness and bias that becomes, so I have both hands, but if I really just like don't use this one, or it's always like this, then it's not so useful anymore. And so I've one-sided myself. So I'd like to say that there's like basic use, and it's passive. It automatically happens in a way for most people, most of the functions. So that to acknowledge that everybody has capacity, we can start from somewhere to start to develop. And then the advanced or sophisticated version, one of the things that happened with the Myers-Briggs type indicator is it kept describing sensing as this passive experience. And I'm receiving through the 5 senses. And I'm like, I've known a number, like my stepmom, ESFP, yes, she receives information through the 5 senses. And if I stopped there, that would be a really one-dimensional description of how she uses extroverted sensing. And so it really is becomes active. And then to get ourselves to ask, even mentally ask, oh, like, how could I use this in an active way? So that and then there's like, the like beginning sort of active way as like a young person who prefers that, like the young ENFP figuring out extroverted intuiting through using like charm and a little bit of storytelling and a little bit of random behavior to magically sort of get adults to do what they want them to do. And eventually that becomes a more mature version where there's like some introverted feeling ethics coming in, sort of constraining that. And then also the maturity of extroverted intuiting can be like, oh, there's this team I need to work with. How can I invisibly guide this team in a way that they don't even know that they're going in the direction that they want and they need to go? And how can I help make that happen? So I believe that, like, and I certainly thought by the time I was 35 or 40, like after I did 8 Keys of Self-Leadership, I thought, my introverted intuiting, great function, all of that dominant function, but I felt like I reached a dead end with it. Like I reached like, it's my dominant function. I can't do anything more with it. I really need to develop other functions. But now looking back, 15 years, I can say, no. There was a lot more I could do with introverted intuiting.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because something that I've been thinking about lately too is that, and I want to get into this, is that it's not like, for me as an ENFJ, for example, it's not so much that I need to necessarily use more TI as it is that my FE needs to become aware of the TI and begin to value that. It's almost like it feels like my FE ups a level, and now it's like the definition of FE isn't that you can't have boundaries and you can't like state what you want and like things like that. And so it's like, for me, increasing my own discernment, saying no, and like all that sort of stuff, I don't have to I don't have to lean down and pick up my TI to do that. My FE now values that. And so I feel like we can kind of pick up some of those things. Like it's like my FE can interact with my other functions and learn. So now I'm at the point where my FE is like, I'm not going to sign any contract or sign on to work with anyone unless I know that this is exactly what I want to do. It's like my FE and NI are like, I have this vision of where I'm going. And I know that I don't want to get tricked, I guess, or I don't want to trick myself into saying yes to something because I like the good vibes going on. Like, and so I have these sort of stricter rules in the FE, if that makes sense, of like, no, if you do that, that's going to make you unhappy. And I have to really feel that in order to live my life that way. Like, I guess I'm still an FE dominant person, like my FE now loves TI, but that doesn't mean that whenever I might advocate for myself that I'm now using TI. Like,
Yeah, no, so I don't know this very well, so I'm speaking a little bit off the cuff, but I understand
mhm,
in-depth psychology or analytical psychology,
mhm,
there are concepts like this. One of them
mhm,
is colonization, where the dominant function is going to go out and look at these other functions and be like, oh, I'm going to develop some of this to meet my own dominant function needs.
mhm,
Okay, we can also, and I very much agree that many people like will say to me, like they see me in like you give a presentation on film or I do an interview or something like that, and you're like, oh no, like you talk about like connecting with people in community and you come up with all these different ideas, so you must be like an ENFP or INFJ or ISFP, or people come up with different types. And I'm like, no, I have extroverted thinking and introverted intuiting. Introverted intuiting does a little prep work beforehand that says, what kind of mode do I need to be in? What do I need to channel? And I use that word specifically. I'm being a medium. What do I need to channel? And then in my head, I have like 1,000 different, this is extroverted thinking, little micro models about communication, about the principles of this, applications of that. I just pull whatever I need from a giant toolbox. And if I look like I'm doing some extroverted intuiting, is because I created a little tool that duplicates something that
yep,
extroverted intuitors often do, so that I too can participate in a brainstorming session in a useful way. That I too can, but it's still coming from this place of like, oh, I don't do this automatically. This is a learned behavior.
oh yeah,
And
that
I've
is
got
a
a lot of learned behaviors now.
that's a really good point, because I was actually recently told that I seems to be a very logical black and white thinker, and it was in a work environment where I feel like I have learned that if I don't make it extremely clear what the expectations are and the due dates and the deadlines and what the workflow is, then I am, with my FE, I'm going to be paranoid and emotionally caught up the entire time, wondering when is someone going to need something from me, and then that wastes my energy, which makes me burn out. And so
Mm,
now I'm proactive in, when do you need this, I'm going to do this then. And or like, I don't understand this workflow, like I'm not afraid to ask questions and clarifications, because I
mhm,
understand the pain of not recognizing the truth. That is a huge thing in my experience, where I've experienced like verbal abuse and gaslighting, to where the truth matters. I
mhm,
care about the truth. Because if I'm not correct in one aspect, there's a huge emotional that that there's a huge emotional reaction that can happen
mhm,
in general, like to being lazy with the truth. So it's like, I try and be proactive with it. It's hard for me, but I totally like how you explained that it's like your NI and TE together have kind of simulated something for this aspect, where like my FE and NI can sort of be like, I'm going to create the system because what it's going to do is it's going to get people off my back so that I'm not worried about other people. And so that now I can arrange a life in which I have more time for me, which is what's going to make me happy. So it's all these sort of backwards, like, I don't know. I guess it doesn't even feel like I'm, again, like reaching down to use TI,
mhm, mhm. Now,
but
I do want
yeah.
to say that in like, you know, when I started practicing yoga a few years ago and getting into that, and what Jung talked about with the body-mind practices,
Hmm.
that so much of like what we've been talking about is a very Western viewpoint of making the ego more functional and sophisticated,
Yes.
which is great. It's great.
Hmm.
The ego is a good thing. It does lots of positive things. Jung also says it may be that our ego is the only thing that's truly us, which is a little bit of a scary thought. So there's that. But he said in the Eastern tradition, there's so much about getting rid of baggage and
Hmm.
getting rid of stuff that isn't there. And I think back, one of the ways that I was able to get in touch with extroverted sensing and stay in touch with that is that, you know, I lived on the beach when I was a kid, and the way that my, not parents but other family members too, would describe me is that I was carefree, and I would get up and, you know, I'd have like a little microphone and dance. And INTJ, who did that when I was 2 or 5, But by the time I was 8, I was definitely like more closed. And by the time I was 15, I was like super closed, would never do something like that. To be able to like discard some of those defensive layers and just go back to that person energetically
Yeah.
in terms of trusting life, that there's, it's like that's a part of me. Don't let that get buried. And the
Yeah.
way to do that is to remove stuff. So I think there's just as much benefit to
Mm.
removing as there is to adding and making more sophisticated. And in practical life, that can be things like simplifying. I really understand what that means now. And by the way, the interesting test for SJ types, healthy SJs are actually very big on simplifying. Unhealthy SJs are the ones who are the hoarders and who are making their life very complicated and all of that. And it's
Yeah.
you can, what are the things that are really important? And if you can't count them on one hand, then it's like maybe you're really overextended or whatever it is. And that's a tremendous amount of stress. And so I would suggest to people, if they want to do type development, you can't develop if there's no room to do that, if there's no energy to do that. So make sure like you really sort through and ask yourself, like, what are the key things that are important? Jettison the other stuff. That doesn't mean jettison it forever, but maybe for now. And you put that aside, and then you create the space in your life. You're like, oh, now I do have time in the morning to exercise instead of obsessively reading political news. I have to see any person I meet who says like, oh, I'm a politics and news junkie. I'm like, oh my God, stay away from me.
Yeah, and I used to be, because I used to think that if I did not feel for every single person, like that, like, but I had to realize that me being outraged isn't going to change anything. There are some things that can change, but it's like I've had to learn how to wield my energy so that it's actually creating the outcome that I want. And I think that for FJs, if you aren't considering the TE, that you aren't really thinking about the outcome sometimes. Like, well, like we do think, I mean, FE is outcome oriented, but what I've noticed is that it's like getting outraged every single time. And then then you're burnt out at the end of the day, and then you have nothing to give. And that's something that I personally, what I'm really passionate about when it comes to developing is honestly helping other FJs in particular, everyone, but like realize that you're more than like what you can give to everyone else. Which I have a couple questions for you before we wrap this up. But I wanted to ask, when you were talking about the Western versus Eastern thing and like the whole concept of the ego, something that I've noticed is I am someone that's very interested in metaphysical stuff, the spiritual community, yoga, shamanic stuff. I've noticed that a lot of people in the spiritual community are almost like afraid of, or not, maybe not afraid, but they don't want to get into the personality stuff because they think it's ego. And I've had people tell me like, oh, well, that's all mind. Like you got to get rid of the mind. You got to be in your soul. And I believe that, the function, like you have to work with your mind, and we shouldn't make the ego like an enemy. I want to know how do you reconcile this, or have you ever heard this?
Oh yeah, no, I mean for sure. I mean this is a theme, and I know someone from India. He's not American. He's from India. He knows type well, ENTP preferences, and he was brought up in an environment that his parents encouraged yoga, and he got very interested in Kundalini and all of this stuff. But he got annoyed with it because it's like it's anti-mind. And like the fundamental teachings aren't necessarily anti-mind, but the community, the way it fosters just like, oh, just repeat the mantra enough times, follow what the guru says, and that's, and I do think that people can be in a place developmentally where they need that, and that is the right approach. But for him, for his type, and for where he was developmentally, he's like, where is the thinking part of it? And so when I looked at what Jung did, I saw, wow, he brought a lot of thinking to this like Eastern tradition. And even within the Eastern tradition, In Buddhism, for example, they talk about 4 chakras that start at the head. And what they mean is not thinking in a cognitive sense, but people living in their heads, like living in illusions. The stories that they tell themselves, as you were talking about. Then they can move down with practice to the throat. And that doesn't mean just talking, it's about learning how to be diplomatic with other people. So that I can hear what other people are saying, I can talk their language, I can do, what we would say now like perspective shifting. That this person gains the power of essentially diplomacy and ability to interrelate. Type is a very, very powerful tool for doing that. To take the person from living in their illusion to knowing how can I shift to somebody else. Then there is the third function, or the third one going down, which will be in the heart. And yeah, I understand living in the heart. I do get that. Mm-hmm. And in practical terms, living in the heart often means it's a seasonal process, like the seasons, and it really is being continuously engaged with one's opposites. Mm-hmm. And there's a room in those 4 seasons to have mental reflection. Mm-hmm. And that's, it's like when I take the acting class that we mm-hmm. went to, mm-hmm. There's the 10-minute activity where there isn't much mental going on in terms of analysis or whatever. You don't want to do that. But notice how there is a discussion afterwards. Mm-hmm. And that the discussion absolutely involves your mental faculties.
Yeah, for me, I don't like when people try and pit the head and the heart sort of against each other. Even in the spiritual community, I've tried to figure out, how do I explain the value of what typology is? And not that it's my job to convince everyone, but I feel like there's such a misconception because of how corporate it could seem. Mm-hmm. So how would you explain, I guess you kind of just explained it in regards to
I would say that there's what they're trying to do, I wouldn't invalidate their goal, because mm-hmm. that's not it, but it's you need a few bridges to get to that goal, mm-hmm. and a few mountains to cross, and in your toolbox there are practices. Mm-hmm. And yoga is an example of a practice. There are many other practices. Gardening is a practice. Baking is a practice. Each of them, when they're done mindfully, almost anything, car repair can be a practice, mm-hmm. if it's done mindfully, or heart and mindfully, together. Mm-hmm. And that's, those, and so to have the capacity to reflect and to find how am I similar or different, and who am I? The idea is not to kill the ego, because nobody can do that, and you're just going to end up as a stunted person. It's raising both bars, so it's raising the sophistication of the ego, and it's getting rid of baggage, and sort of engaging in these basic practices. And I do agree that one of the reasons why these basic practices like yoga have survived for so long is because they do work for a lot of people. Yeah. And so there's, as long as they're speaking at a certain human level, that's great. But there is also this need to be the person will never really, in yoga terms, I'm what? You're skipping the 5th and 6th chakras? Is that what you're telling me? But it's sort of tough, because folks have come along to redefine the 6th chakra as about intuition. Yeah. And then the heart is about feeling, and then the throat is just about voicing your feelings and your intuition. So it sounds like an ENFJ who did not value introverted thinking got hold of the model yeah. and decided we're not going to have thinking fit anywhere in this model. Yeah. And I'm my eyes, my brain, my throat, my hands. All of these are tools for thinking too. My feet are tools for thinking too. And when they say live, they're going to think of being mental as living in the mind. And you're I understand, we're not going to overanalyze. This is a mirror.
If it was an ENFJ, it's the mind could feel synonymous with your inner critic that is criticizing you, but that's just how it feels for inferior TI.
Yeah. But which is why when I did Jung on yoga, I specifically mm-hmm. broke out the 6th function. And I love, because in the 6th chakra, because in the 5th chakra, Jung really gives a very mental thinking aspect to it. And then in the 6th, there's Jung's version of it, which is actually the intuitive one. And then I break it off into this other one that's like, where's the thinking component? The wise person, you know, like Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have a thinking organ where we're going to take responsibility for it. And I would say, you know, so much about wholeness is about, and that's like in Kundalini yoga, it's healthy, you know, happy, holy, and there's a quality of wholeness to it. You can't reject the mind and say you're a whole person.
Yeah, and something I've wondered too is like, I almost wonder if the throat chakra is where all of the mental functions, like, I don't know if you associate the functions with chakras at all, but like something I think about is FE even emotions at all? Or is that just how I mentally process things?
Jung said that all of them are mental. He even gave
Yeah.
quotes, and Isabel Myers as well gave quotes about how like extroverted sensing is mental. If you talk to SP types, they will describe to you a mental process as like I know somebody who was a football player, like a professional pro football player, SP, and is actually an incredibly mental activity for him. Everything, his mind can slow down the field to such a slow rate that then he can engage in tactical choices, as what you and I would see as just like whoosh, something going right past us.
Yep.
And he's very much using his brain. And we all have emotions.
Yeah.
I would say that for thinking types, there's a tendency to either use emotions as data or to put on armor in order to push away the emotions, because they can become overwhelming and difficult. So I do believe there's a relationship between like feeling and emotions are like good friends. Thinking, function, and like mental life are good friends. But ultimately, you know, feeling is supposed to be like thinking, a decision-making function, organizing and decision-making. They're just, one is based more upon values, society, identity, worth of things. The other one is based more upon criteria, empiricism, all of that. And it's difficult to be objective if I'm allowing myself to feel all these feelings all the time.
Yeah.
You know, I prided myself with students that, of course, there were some students that I liked personally more than others, but this should never influence what grade I give them. Like, there's just no question. Like, that's not even a choice to make. Like, it just, I have this actually introverted feeling belief it should never influence. The extroverted thinking is like, yeah, we'll use a point system. And they work nicely together. And I think that's a way to overcome it, is to see how they work hand in hand.
So yeah, speaking of that, the last thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of the transcendent function and using the opposites in tandem. And I think that what you were talking about with Jung, honestly, a lot of his work, I think, is a great job of using feeling and thinking kind of in tandem, because it is like a tool that has great value, but also there's a lot of logic behind why it's valuable. And when you mentioned yoga earlier too, I was thinking about how, especially with Kundalini yoga, I think that that's a great tool for sensing and intuition in tandem, because at least for me, I'm trying to get more into yoga, and it helps me like listen to my body if I have a purpose for it. Even like with meditations that are like body scan meditations where you're supposed to like feel your feet and up to your head, I'm like, oh, okay, I have like a direction or a reason for why I'm doing this. And it makes me feel more purposeful as opposed to just being in there. So can you, I guess that's not really a question, but anything you want to add on how, because, okay, actually, I've seen a lot of people on the internet accuse you of being an ENFP or an ESFP, and you did mention that before. And when you talked about the acting class, I think that it seems like an example of you intentionally using your feeling and your sensing to just be with another person and allow yourself to feel. How?
That's not what I do, though.
Okay, can you explain?
It's really, for those of you who don't know, like in the Meisner School of Acting, there's a technique, a prep technique called repetition or repeat. And the teacher is a great teacher. Her mother trained with the original, with Meisner, all of this she started doing as a child. I think she's INFJ preferences. It's a very INFJ practice. I think it can be very feeling oriented. For me, the first time I went was with an ISFP, and the ISFP commented afterwards, he's like, I can really see like every move you're making and like the choices you make with the other person and stuff. And I'm like, really, that's so interesting, because all I do when I go up there is I put myself into a certain hypnotic state. And now I've done it enough that I know exactly how to get into that state. And I allow whatever to happen, but it is all mediated from that sort of semi-trance state. And INTJ,
that's the transcendent function?
It's the introverted intuiting. It's introverted intuiting.
How do you think that you have used or would suggest others to use the transcendent function to mediate the opposites? So maybe it's not like super logical of you thinking, oh, I need to do this in order to feel my feelings, but it does seem in general, looking at your life, that you have made an effort to some extent to mediate. So
well, the Jung described that there's this one-sidedness that develops in people. And it can be one-sidedness around practical things, not just the functional things, health and whatever. And when we neglect something in a one-sided way, there are ramifications that happen. So the ENFP or ENTP who neglects introverted sensing and extroverted sensing, ultimately their body is going to break down. There's only so much caffeine and sugar and whatever it is that they can do before it comes up. And the tension starts to arise and problems start to develop. They come into awareness into the person's life. And as they arise, the person is given the chance to like look at this other thing and like push it away, or maybe do something about it to resolve it just enough, or begin to engage in a dialogue to say, maybe how I do things with, say, extroverted intuiting and then introverted sensing is not balanced. And how can I find a new, like maybe change careers so that they're doing something that is more for their health. It doesn't mean more physical extroverted sensing, but is at least more for their health, like slower pace, or they make better distinctions. It could be a solution through the second function, better distinctions about what's important in terms of how to spend their time. And so I think that there's this process where we have one-sidedness, the ramifications come up, and then Jung said it, once they come up, it is the job of the ego to figure out solutions. And a well-developed ego can then, it's the unconscious that pushed it up, and then the conscious that needs to do something with it, and ideally something new comes out of it. It's a resolution, not just a compromise, but it's something completely fresh. So when the person looks back 10 years, they're like, oh, I would never have thought I would be in this place. Or I wanted to, but I had no idea how I would get here. And so that's, that is, it's a little bit of trusting that process. And yet I say, it's probably safer to work on like second and third function, tandem stuff, than to work in first and fourth, or to begin to try and bring in the seventh and eighth functions. Because the seventh and eighth are trickster and demonic because they compete directly with the person's ego. And so ENTJs and INTJs should not go off doing extroverted feeling, because that actually erases their strength. But they do need to pay attention, as you described it, I thought very nicely, find ways in their life to include other people, to ask myself, what do the people in this room need and what do they value? And how can I meet that? Or to pay attention emotionally, how does this person feel right now? And maybe like, I don't need to push them on this. Like there's ways to incorporate that really allow it to happen. But I would say if for any person, it's to consider where you're one-sided and to get feedback about that, because usually the ways we're most one-sided, neither we nor immediately the people near us know.
Yeah. Something I would recommend to TJs or INTJs, just from my perspective, is that honestly, if you work on your FI, like that creates this wonderful mood in the room that FE is going to enjoy. And you don't really have to not be yourself. Like, no FE user's gonna want, like, if an FE user felt like you were trying to not be yourself, we'd be like, oh no, be yourself. So it's like, I guess, I think that, you know, our other, like, our tertiary maybe could compensate for a lot of things and a lot of problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
And that really, you know, that gets at what I think Linda would say, that, you know, we're organisms in an ecology. Linda Behrens, we're organisms in an ecology. So whenever you think about, like, what do I do with changes in my life, or like maybe I want to work on this part of myself, does that actually fit in that ecology? So do I need to bring a polar bear into the jungle? And that's maybe the answer is no. And there's a smarter way to do it that really honors my tech, because I can't get away from the fact that I'm an introvert, and I can perform wonderfully in front of the camera, but it's a camera and it's a context and it's a container. And the moment I step out of that, I'm like, oh, good, that's over with. I'm going to go back to my room now, you know, in the hotel, and like be quiet and like do what I like to do. And there's, so that, like, maintaining balance is part of it. And there's no magic formula, but in like an 8 Keys book and other places, I do think that we can learn from each other, and we can hear examples. And out of that menu of examples, we can find things that fit ecologically.
Yeah, that's a really good, it's interesting to think about it as far as the ecologically, because I think that kind of fits how some people, maybe your first instinct is, oh, I don't want to do that because that doesn't fit my type. Where it's like, it's almost like there's a balance between, you should stretch, but you also shouldn't, like to honor those preferences as well, like be in your natural habitat, I guess. So,
I have one thing that I want to say, which is not something I thought of on my own. I have to give an ENFP credit for this. We can, using type, we can hurt ourselves too, because it gives us tolerance. And sometimes that will give us the tolerance to things that they're not good for us to tolerate.
Interesting. Can you explain
that? And that's like, we can explain somebody is in a marriage and they're unhappy. So I knew this was the ENFP about another ENFP and his ESTJ girlfriend. And he knew type, and he used type as a way to rationalize, because he had more knowledge, and oh, she's an ESTJ and da. No, he was unhappy and he was hurting himself.
Yeah.
And it's like, she was going to be happier with somebody else, and he was going to be happier with somebody else. Like, let it go. So don't hold type lightly. Don't clutch it. You know, if somebody's going to steal it from you, just hold it lightly. And it's okay to say, you know what, type says this, but this is still not right for me.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of something I was talking to an ENFP friend about, Crystal, actually, is that we realized that us understanding type has allowed us to sort of like, every time I can see that her FI almost wants to be validated or wants a cookie, wants me to be like, there, it's like, and then like for me, if I need FE validation of being like, hey, you're my best friend ever or something, we almost like don't even do that, because we understand each other so much that we just don't even, like, I don't know, like, and we don't expect it from each other. Like, I've learned that I shouldn't expect FE from an ENFP necessarily. I mean, like, they can, but I just know how they operate, and knowing that is enough for, I think my NI can sort of
exactly right. Many times knowing is enough, and we don't need to put this big burden that says we have to develop and this and that. I feel it's more important for a person to simply say, you're you and I'm me.
Yes.
And it's not the golden rule, it's the platinum rule, which is treat others how they would want to be treated. And that's actually a lot of work. And I get reminded that it's hard still to just do even that.
Yeah. And thanks for saying that, because I guess we were like, okay, we know. And she even said to me, she's like, I feel like I should be using more FE to you because you deserve that. Or like, I've just kind of been like, oh, no, I don't need I don't need it because I don't expect it anymore. And like, that's the big breakthrough for me, is that I no longer expect this sort of FE from everyone, where before, like when I was in high school or something, a lack of reaction from someone seemed like, oh, they secretly hate me. Because like for me, like honestly, for an ENFJ, when an ENFJ doesn't like you, they're just going to not share their TI and not react. And so if I'm going to just assume everyone's like me, then any sort of non-reaction, it could be like, oh no, what's underneath there? What sort of TI are you hiding? And it's like not really how people work. And so, yeah, I do think understanding could be so much, but we even were like, I think, not that I need to use more FI, but like, would it really kill me to validate FI like ever so often? Or like, I don't know.
No, and it is tough, because the more I've used type over the years, one is the more I discovered there's something to go back to. The well always has not only water, but other things to give. And we really are, every person is very, I mean, in addition to our human commonalities, I don't want to say we're all just different and then that's it. We have a lot in common, but the type differences are real. And they're not just behavior trait differences like in 5-factor model. They're underlying experience, like how do I experience what the situation is? And that's very different from somebody else. And that's just, and that's part of, how we are.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything else you'd like to add regarding, maybe you want to share what you're working on now or anything?
Yeah, this the workshop that I've given a few times on this like magic diamond. I'm trying to turn that into a book. I've had a surprisingly difficult time with it, not for lack of material, but to go from slide format and talk workshop format to book format was not apparently a natural transition. So it's been a little tough, but this idea, like putting the transcendent function first. Yeah. And this idea of, I don't have it printed out, but so much there's this idea of polarity between like thinking and feeling or sensing, intuiting, or whatever it is. But Jung really described it that there's this like undifferentiated, and then we go this way thinking or this way feeling, but that ultimately what we want is integrated judgment or integrated perception. And so what does that journey look like? And so that's this like magic diamond is what I'm working on as a tool or resource. I would say it's a resource for people to turn to help balance things out for themselves. And which involves, a lot of type materials are very positive. Every one of the 8 functions has a full page of all of the horrible pitfalls when we overuse it.
Yeah.
So that will be motivation and to identify and then find different ways to balance, to overcome one-sidedness. That's it's, we'll see when it comes out. It comes out.
Yeah, let it happen.
For those of you who follow the brain imaging stuff, I've been doing more number crunching and research with that, of course, over the years. But I've really gotten more like looking at all the ENFJs, all the INTJs, INTPs, ENFPs. I did a few other types like ISTP. And to see like what are the flavors of each type based on their brain wiring and how this career influence things. So I just want people to know, like I'm still working on that, but it's a baby that was not 9 months. It was.
Yeah. So I feel like I have to ask a very ENFJ question though, is why this diamond magic, you call it?
The magic diamond.
Magic diamond. Yeah. Tell me why you believe in this so much and why you're passionate about this.
I found it helpful for me. A lot of people find the framework helpful. It gives a sense of validation while at the same time pushing them to grow. And together I feel that's like really powerful. If I needed to make a list of all of the things in my life that I found benefited me, it's more than type for sure. I mean, I studied some neuro-linguistic programming. I think that that's a fantastic, complement to type.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very interested in role-playing games and games in general, and that really has influenced me a lot. So there's, there's stuff in engineering. So it's not my only interest, but why I've kept with it is because it really does seem to have this powerful influence for people that's positive. And we so desperately need that
Mm-hmm.
against everything else.
Yeah.
And otherwise, it's just like we rely upon luck in a way that, the child grows up with parents who understand why their kid is a weirdo.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. And so it has the capacity to help people in so many ways. And the help is organic and it's messy. And it's not like I'm going to take a pill and then the pill will solve my problems. Or the academic approach is we're going to categorize you and we're going to give you we're going to represent you as a bar graph or something like that. You can't do anything with that.
Yeah.
And you can do something with it.
Yeah. It's been very frustrating for me. I have only 1 year left with my master's in psychology. And I really just all of this stuff that you're talking about, I'm just like, this is the code. The code was cracked. And I know that that's not, it's going to continuously unravel, but that's why, I'm so fascinated by it, is because I've seen how it's helped my relationships. And it's the more I allow myself to shift my mindset in this way, I'm amazed at how far I come in a year, in a month. Mm-hmm. Where I look back and I don't even recognize myself. And that just keeps happening. And it's a little scary. What you're saying about the shadow and everything, it really is scary. If you keep transforming yourself, then that means that you might keep passing things by, in your life.
Yes. And
mm-hmm.
I think that this is, we're not alone. And in a way, this mm-hmm. happens to everyone. So it used to be that the definition of personality in academic psychology, the definition was stable characteristics. That's what's personality. That's what your personality is. Over a lifetime. And they have found in longitudinal studies that in 10-year intervals or 5-year intervals, that the personality characteristics do remain relatively stable. They shift somewhat, but relatively. However, once you add up all of those changes, so now when we look back on studies which have been going on for over half a century, that people will, at the end of their lives, arrive with a set of characteristics or traits, or however you want to call it, the way they express themselves, what's important, all of that, that's completely different than when they started out. And it's like, I watched this interview a few days ago with a very successful ESTP entrepreneur who, if you didn't know it, would think that he's an ENFJ. Because, of course, there's the extroverted feeling, and there's some introverted intuiting, and yet underneath, there's still he reminds me so much of my uncle, who's also in his 70s and is an ESTP.
Are you talking about Gary Vaynerchuk or no? Or never mind.
There's people. There's.
Oh, no. I just that reminded me of someone else, but never mind.
And it's just there are things that I experience and would say now that I know my younger self would be like, what?
Yeah.
And you just wouldn't understand and wouldn't appreciate. On the other hand, I have sensing people in my life and my family who remind me I'm not really that different than I was 30 years ago. There's a lot of qualities which are the same. I'm still recognizable as me. But and then we come to the phrase, it's each of us, when we grow, we remain ourselves, but only more so.
Mm-hmm.
Not in an unbiased way, but that we fulfill our potential. We complete our pattern.
Well, that seems like a wonderful way to end it. Completing your pattern. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and sharing your knowledge, and honestly just being an example for people who are wanting to grow themselves. So thank you so much. And
it was my pleasure. It absolutely was. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Cheers.
Bye.